All right, 10.8. Two objectives here. This is all with imaginary numbers. And here's what all of imaginary numbers deals with. That basically up until this point, if we took the square root of negative 25, this was no solution. Now, they kind of put a little asterisk here. They're going to tell you, all right, that this was actually really no real solution. Okay, here's what imaginary numbers does. That basically, everything with imaginary numbers spins off one big topic. Kept trying to get the term blue. What term blue? So it's I squared equals negative 1. That's the whole thing that happens here. Here's what imaginary numbers is. Here's the whole thing that it spins off of. That you're going to replace the negative with I squared. So here's basically what it comes down to for this part. And here's kind of where we're going with this thing. So before we had the problem like this, we took square root of negative 25 as negative no solution. All right, now what we're going to do is, if they give you square root of negative 25, they're going to tell you, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to really think about this as negative 1 times 25. And we're going to take out this negative 1, and we're going to replace it with I squared. Okay, and if you square root I squared, just like if we square root x squared earlier when we were solving, if you had a square of a square root, they cancel each other out. This would just be I. If you square root 25, that would be 5. So it's I times 5. And again, we always put the coefficient first. So if we rewrote this one, this would be 5I. So everything up until now, if we took the square root of negative 25, it was no solution. And technically, it was no real solution. Now, when we do this, if we square root negative 25, we're going to get 5, but we're going to put an I in there to know that, okay, this is not a real solution, that's going to be an imaginary solution. And if you're an electrician, they do a lot with the I variables and the J variables because they start talking about flows of electricity, and sometimes you get a flow that kind of goes negative, it goes backwards, and so they can kind of use that sometimes. If you're not going to be an electrician, you're never going to have to worry about this. All right, so and again, the only difference that you're going to have for these, if they give you a number, if we were doing the square root of 36, that would just be 6. And all they're going to do for everything that's here is they're going to say, all right, well, instead of giving you this, we're just going to give you the square root of negative 36. It's still going to be 6, but the I just becomes a marker to let us know, okay, this wasn't a positive number in the beginning, it's going to let us know that was a negative number. So anytime you get an I in the answer for this thing, that's your marker to know that we started off with a negative number and not a positive number. And that's the only difference of the problem when you go through this thing. And then what they're going to do after that is, besides giving you perfect square root numbers, so they're going to give you some that you're going to have to actually break down just a little bit. So they'll give you something like this. Let's say it's going to be the square root of negative, let's go square root of like negative 48. Okay, and again, if you want to think about it this way, where it's not a perfect square root, you can just take the 48 and start breaking it down. If you start multiplying it out, you get, again, I'm going to go with 16 times 3, because if you did that, you get square root of 16 is a perfect square root. So you can take the square root of 16 and make that 4. And you're going to be stuck with the square root of 3 that's here. And the only thing that would be different for negative 48, it's still going to be 4 square root of 3. You just put an I at the end of it. Now, the only thing on that I is just make sure it's not underneath the square root. Sometimes for that one, and you may have to kind of watch and see, they may actually make you rewrite it like this, so that you know that the I is not underneath the square root. So they might let you go back and forth kind of either way down. we didn't mark any of these, so let me kind of go back to this. These were all just kind of all over the place. All right, let's give you one more of these. Let's say we're doing like the negative square root of negative 52. All right, if you go back and kind of do 52, think about 52 and start breaking it down. You can make that, if you can't think of a perfect square root that will come out of it, it is even, so you could rewrite it as 2 times 26, which would then be 2 times 13. So it's 2 times 2 times 13. There's your exit buddies, because you get the 2 times 2, which would be 4. If you square that 4, that's just a 2. So that's 2 times the square root of 13. Okay, so if it was the square root of negative 52, this part will wind up being 2 square root of 13. And again, because of the negative that's here, you're going to mark that with an I to know that was here. The negative that was in front, that's just there hanging out. So same thing with that one. That negative's just going to hang out in front of it there. Okay, so the whole big thing they're trying to get you to see on that one is that if you have numbers now with negatives, you would break it down just like it was if it was a positive number. The only thing you do different is you put an I in there, either right behind here or out here. As long as you got the I in there somewhere, I'm good with it. You just may have to watch and see how the online homework wants it, because sometimes they want it here instead of here, so just kind of watch on those and see what they have you do. They should take it either way. Hopefully they will. If not, hopefully they'll clue you in and say, well, you have it correct, but let's rewrite it this way, hopefully. Okay, so that's objective 1. Objective 2, all they're going to do is they're going to give you numbers that you have, but now they're going to ask you to maybe either going to multiply or you're going to divide. And they're not going to ask you to add and subtract, because the adding and subtracting is really not anything different than doing it with any other variable. So if they talk about adding the imaginary numbers, you would just add the whole numbers, and then you add the I terms together, and then so there's really not much to that one at all. This one they just kind of focus on multiplying and dividing. Here's the catch on this one. Here's what basically you have to do. That whenever they give you a problem that's got a negative inside the square root, you've got to rewrite it in terms of I first. If you don't, it might mess your answer up just enough to make it wrong. Sometimes you might get lucky and it be alright, but sometimes it's going to make it wrong. So rewrite everything in terms of I first, and then once you've done that, then you can go ahead and simplify. Or multiply, or divide, whatever it is that they ask you to do. Okay, and we'll run through 3 or 4 different examples, because they're going to give you a whole variety of different things on this one. I think this is one of those problems where, if I'm thinking back when I'm looking at these, I think they give you like 2 problems in one. So you've got one problem that you'll do, you got another problem, and that one whole thing counts as a problem. So they'll make you do a lot more to it, something like that. Okay, so here we go. Let's go square root of negative 72 over square root of negative 6. Okay, and honestly, on this one, the very first thing that you want to do before you do any simplifying at all is get rid of this negative that you have in here. Go ahead and take the I part of it out. So you've got I, and make it the square root of 72. And on the bottom, do the same thing. Go ahead and take this negative out, put the I on the outside. So you've got square root of 6. Okay, then simplify what you can. You've got 72 divided by 6. So we've got I over I. If we back up just a second, you go ahead and take 72 and over 6, because you can divide those two numbers. 72 divided by 6 is 12. And what happens when you do I divided by I? Just cancel that, right? It's gone. So basically this thing, the i's cancel each other out. You're left with square root of 12. And then go ahead and just break that down. 12 would be 4 times 3. But you take the square root of 4 to make it a perfect square root. So that would make it 2 square root of 3. Okay. Now some people may look back at this and go, well, what happens back here? What if I went ahead and did negative I by negative? That automatically came out to be a square root of 12. Sometimes you get lucky in doing the wrong thing first and it still comes out okay. Let's show you one here where if you didn't do it the right way, you would get the wrong answer. So, let's do the square root of negative 49 times the square root of negative 36. Okay, again, very first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the negative that we have out and replace it with an I. So we've got I times the square root of 49 times I times the square root of 36. But again, square root of 49 is just 7. Square root of 36 is 6. Okay, so you've got I times I, which would be I squared. You've got 7 times 6, which would be 42. Okay, now here's the one time where this is going to kind of go back to this one. Back in the beginning back here we said that if you had I squared, that was going to be the same thing as negative 1. If you're doing multiplication or division, really it's more multiplication because you won't get division. But if you're doing multiplication, anytime you get I squared, you have to take this number out and replace it with a negative 1. So take out the I squared, replace it with negative 1. So it's negative 1 times 42. That's one which would be a negative 42. If you didn't take the negatives out to start with, you would have just done a negative times negative. You would have made it a positive. And then when you break those numbers down, it would have given you an answer of positive 42. Not a big deal, but it's a big enough deal that you miss it, and then, you'd be like, well, where's that negative come from? So that you have to do that part first with the I variables. Especially with multiplication. Division, you can get away with it, but with multiplication, if you don't do that, it will change the answer. So it's something like that. Okay, so let's go square root of 64 times the square root of negative 144. Okay, square root of 64, it's good to go. There's nothing with that part. So that one, you can go ahead and just make that 8. But with this one, again, with the negative, the very first thing is we're going to take that I out. Or take the negative out to make it an I. So it's 8 times I times the square root of 144. Again, square root of 144 is just 12. 8 times 12 is 96. You have the one I that's by itself. There's nothing else to multiply with it. So that one would just stay 96I. Okay. And they'll just bounce through, different numbers, having you do different parts with these. But the main thing on that one is that, again, the very first thing you want to do is take out the negative, and basically you can just take the negative out, put the I on the outside of the lead quotes marker, and then you just go back and simplify down the square root. Sometimes it's an easy simplifying. Sometimes you got to work it out a little bit to kind of get through the numbers.